That's the good news.
Okay, aber es geht ja nicht um uns, es geht ja hier um die Forschung. Und er kann leider nicht physisch bei uns sein, er war erst vor 4 Wochen auf einer Konferenz in Oslo. Peter Ritt aus Australien, der Flug dauert mindestens dann insgesamt 20 und mehr Stunden. Peter Ritt ist wirklich einzigartig. Er ist Geophysiker, der seit 30 Jahren über das Great Barrier Reef forscht. Das berühmte Barrier Reef, das schon längst tot ist, angeblich. Sein Gebiet der Forschung ist die Küstenozeanographie, die Effekte von Sedimenten auf küstennahe Korallenriffe, außerdem die Entwicklung von Instrumenten, ein Begriff, den kenne ich nicht auf Deutsch, Geophysical Sensing der Erde und Hydrodynamik von Mangrovensümpfen. Bis Professor Reed unrechtmäßig von der James Cook University entlassen wurde, arbeitete er als Wissenschaftler und in einer erfolgreichen Beratergruppe, der Marine Geophysics Laboratory. Da hat er sich mit der Entwicklung von Instrumenten befasst, einschließlich Sensoren für die Sedimentablagerung und weitere Instrumente zur empirischen Forschung. Außerdem arbeitet er zudem noch auch in Anwendungen in der Landwirtschaft, wie man mechanisch Unkräuter entfernen kann. Peter Ritt ist einer der ganz wenigen Leute, die wirklich seit Jahrzehnten, wahrscheinlich sogar der Einzige, seit Jahrzehnten über das Great Barrier Reef forscht. Und als ich in Oslo gesprochen hatte, sagte er, weißt du, das Interessante ist, als ich angefangen habe, da gab es 5 Leute, die überhaupt dieses Marine Biology Gebiet erforscht haben. Mittlerweile, ich weiß, wenn ich richtig erinnere, waren es vielleicht 1000, die aber wahrscheinlich in erster Linie vor ihren Computern sitzen. Okay, so without much further ado, I want to introduce Peter Ritt. And Peter Ritt, you're welcome. We welcome you with your talk about the Great Barrier Reef. Thanks for having you.
Thanks very much. Yes, so we're going to talk about the Great Barrier Reef and the effect of climate change on it, but we're going to drift a little bit to other supposed threats to the Great Barrier Reef and also essentially talk about the reason why we're in this mess, which is essentially a fundamental untrustworthiness of our science institutions, especially when it's anything to do with environmental science. So we're going to go a little bit into some of the agricultural threats to the Great Barrier Reef. If you could move to the next slide, please, which has got the BBC on it. Just in the last month or so, a big state and federal Australian government report came out and said and told the whole world that the Great Barrier Reef was in a very poor condition. And you can just imagine that the Queensland tourist industry, because the Great Barrier Reef is one of our main tourist attractions, was absolutely aghast when our own government tells the whole world that the reef is in very poor shape and uses pictures like these, which actually show that it's in fact in wonderful condition. I often compare it with perhaps the French government saying that the Eiffel Tower is a rusty piece of scrap and telling the whole world. You can imagine what damage that would do to the tourist industry, and it certainly damaged the tourist industry in North Queensland. But it's not the only area where we have problems. If you could move to the next slide, which has got a list of words. It says the whole world has been told that the reef is essentially almost finished. And it's not just one threat. We're told with climate change, it's, the carbon dioxide is changing the climate. But for the reef, it's mud or sediment from agriculture, nutrients, which is fertilizer from agriculture, and pesticides from agriculture are all killing the reef. Also, marine dredging, this is digging up for ports, climate change, overfishing, ocean acidification, even medical drugs and sunscreen are supposedly killing the reef. Antifoulant paints from shipping, coal dust, and even crazy things like land-derived fungal dust. So you can see it's not just one thing, just about everything it actually kills the Great Barrier Reef. We could move on to the next slide, which has 2 pictures. And why does it matter? Well, it's not just the climate change. it's actually affecting every industry in North Queensland. So the mining industry is supposedly killing the reef, agriculture, and it's affecting tourism as well. And just recently, we've had some very stringent new government legislation, which is having a major impact on the tourist industry, on the agricultural industry, which is mainly cattle on the left and sugarcane on the right. So before we go into this, we can move on to the next slide, which is a picture of the Great Barrier Reef, and we need a little bit of a geography lesson of the reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is roughly the same area as Germany, and it's mostly quite a long distance off the coast, so between 40 and 100 kilometres off the coast. And it's one of the most pristine and untouched parts of the world, full stop. So along that whole coastline, there's only about 500,000, maybe 600,000 people living along that whole coastline, which is around about just over almost 2,000 kilometres long. For the top 500, the most northerly 500 kilometres of that coastline, there would be less than 1,000 people living along that coastline. So it's utterly pristine and unspoiled. And it almost beggars belief that we have managed to convince the whole world that it is in a dire predicament. Okay, so next slide, which shows a picture of some of the 3,000 individual reefs of the Great Barrier Reef. So each of those are a reef. One of the reefs, they're usually a few kilometres in size, and they're separated from anything from a few hundred metres to a few kilometres from the next reef. If we go to the next slide, which is a very brightly coloured slide, looking down at a part of the reef near Cairns, which is our main tourist area, and the reef is about 100 kilometres or 60 kilometres across at that point there, and the reefs are the bright red patches. And you see further to the right of the picture, it drops down into the deep ocean water, which is about 1,000 metres deep. Now, most of the reef lives on what we call the continental shelf, which is less than 100 metres deep. So if you go back only 18,000 years ago, when the sea level was 120 odd metres lower than it is today, the Great Barrier Reef didn't exist. It was just a grassy plain, and each of the reefs was a flat-topped hill covered in trees and grass. But when the sea level rose, the reef regrow as it has done many times in the past. The reason I say that is just to demonstrate that the reef is a very, very resilient organism, resilient area. It's not easy to kill, or at least it comes back very quickly. If we go to the next slide, which talks about mud from the reef. So the farmers are told all the soil erosion from the farms is actually killing the reef. And this is a most incredible thing. So because in fact, when you go out to the Great Barrier Reef, and this is a typical picture of the Great Barrier Reef, you have sparkling clear water, the most unbelievably clear water. And that sediment on the bottom there is calcium carbonate sand. It's made up of crushed up pieces of coral that have been laid down over the last few hundred or few thousand years. If you actually take a sample of this, there is no land-derived sediment on this reef. So when 99% of the corals are, there is no mud, and yet the farmers are told that they're killing the reef. This is much worse than the climate change thing, because, you know, whether you believe that carbon dioxide is causing climate change, we do know at least that the carbon dioxide levels are going up. So there is sort of a hypothesis there. But here, there is no mud on the reef, so how can it be actually killing the reef? All right, if we go to the next slide, which is now a repeat, remember that the Great Barrier Reef is a long way from the coast, and this is why the mud which comes out of the rivers in big floods doesn't reach it. However, if we go to the next slide, just occasionally, when the rivers do flow, a small amount of sediment does reach the reef. Now, this only occurs very, very rarely. So we've got to remember that Australian rivers are not like German rivers. Australian rivers, for most of the time, are dry. There is no water in them. But then we get massive amount of rain. We can easily get a metre of rain in just a few days, and they flood, and a large amount of sediment will run out of these rivers. This may only last a few days and not recur for a year or more. And this picture is a very famous picture. It was on the BBC just a few days ago. It comes from February this year, where for once a very small amount of sediment reached one of these reefs. So the reefs are off to the right of the where the yellow arrows are. The muddy plume from the river reached one or two of these 3,000 reefs, and it only reached it for a few days, and the sediment concentration was incredibly low. And for the next few years, maybe even 10 years, this won't happen again. So what the scientists do is they choose one of these satellite photographs, but for the next 3,500 days, 10 years of days, this picture will just look like bright blue. So they only choose the very spectacular images which show what they want to show, when in fact this sediment almost never gets to the reef, and there is no or almost no sediment whatsoever on these reefs. It's a shocking situation. Now, it does happen that there are some reefs very, very close inshore, and myself and a group from my laboratory, we invented the instruments to measure sediment concentrations over long periods. So we know a lot about this. And in fact, the most sediment that most of these close inshore reefs see is from resuspension of the seabed by waves which churn up the seabed. So again, the effect of the rivers is almost non-existent. Now, it's not the only agricultural threat that's non-existent. So these rivers also carry with them a lot of nutrients. There isn't very much fertilizer put on these farms like there is in Germany or Holland, but there is nutrients that's carried with them. And these are also supposedly killing the Great Barrier Reef. But it turns out there's 100 times more nutrients that cycles through the seabed than comes down all the rivers. So again, the effect of the rivers is negligible relative to the natural effects. All right, so if we could move on to the next slide, which is talking about coral bleaching, which is probably what a lot of you people have heard about, not the agricultural threats. So mass coral bleaching is when we get very, very hot weather and the coral goes white, essentially like this photograph here. And it really is a story made in heaven to demonstrate what a disaster climate change will be, because what can happen is that an area the size of a small European country, certainly bigger than Luxembourg and maybe even as big as Holland, can be affected by the bleaching. And it's very spectacular, and because it happens when there's warm weather, it's sort of plausible. But it's also wrong, right? Because we know these bleaching events, despite what the scientists have said, have been happening since time immemorial. All right, we'll talk about it a little more in a minute. But before we do, if we can move on to the next slide, which is a graph. And on that graph, we see on the vertical axis, we see the coral calcification rate, which is really the coral growth rate, how fast the coral grows, and along the horizontal axis is the temperature. And you can see what everybody knows, which is that coral grows better in warmer water. And in fact, it grows right up to well into the high 30 degrees in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Off to the left of the graph there, you can see the slowest growth rates, and those are in areas in the southern Great Barrier Reef where the water is colder. The northern Great Barrier Reef is more or less in the centre, and the best coral grows in Thailand and Papua New Guinea, where the same corals as grow on the Great Barrier Reef grow considerably faster because the water is 1 or 2 degrees warmer there. And there is no doubt that if we get climate change, if the temperature continues to rise from whatever cause, the corals will actually grow faster. If you want to see very bad corals, you can go to Norway, where there are corals and they grow so imperceptibly slowly it's ridiculous. There's even corals in the north of Scotland. But if you want good reefs, you go to a warmer climate. It's obvious. All right, if we go to the next slide, which shows 4 pictures, we need a little marine biology lesson here. So the question is, why does the coral go white when it bleaches? Well, the reason is that coral contains within it these, on the right-hand picture at the top, these microscopic algae called zooxanthellae, and these live inside the coral polyp. So the big coral is made up of little coral polyps, and inside the coral polyp, lives the zooxanthellae. And it is a plant and it gives energy to the polyp, which is an animal. All right. And we're going to look at two types of coral. We have the one on the bottom left, which are the staghorn type corals, and they grow very, very quickly, and they're very susceptible to be bleached. And on the bottom right, we have these great big blocks of coral, which are far less likely to be bleached. All right, so we go on to the next slide, which has got a lot of, which says a masterpiece of cooperation. The thing about the zooxanthellae is that for some reason it's not understood that when the temperature gets high, the zooxanthellae is ejected from the coral and it goes white because the natural colour of the coral is actually white, and the coral colour you see is actually the colour of the zooxanthellae. And this happens when the water temperature is high or low, or when there's fresh water. In fact, almost any stress will make the coral expel out the zooxanthellae. But the thing is that in hot water, in fact, the bleaching is not a death sentence. Most corals that bleach will actually recover. They bring back in the zooxanthellae. It's actually a strategy of life, not a death sentence. In Australia, when we get very dry weather, a lot of trees will drop their leaves as a defense mechanism. You can think about it in a similar vein as that. It's some sort of defense mechanism to allow the coral to live. Now, the thing about the bleaching is it tends to occur when the water gets hotter than normal for that area. So a particular coral might bleach at 26 degrees in the southern Great Barrier Reef, but in the hotter waters of the northern Great Barrier Reef, it may bleach at 28 degrees. It's the relative change that's important. The other thing is that corals are born without the zooxanthellae. They actually take them in from the water. So the water is actually has got contained within it these zooxanthellae drifting around, and somehow the coral grabs that and uses it for its own purpose, and also gives the zooxanthellae a good home. All right, so let's go on to the next slide, which shows a single picture of the short-lived acropora corals. Now, these are what we call the staghorn corals, and they are very susceptible to bleaching. And it turns out that they take in a species of zooxanthellae, which may make them grow very, very rapidly, but it makes them susceptible to bleaching. Now, the thing about acropora is that they're likely to be killed by a hurricane. So if a hurricane goes through, because they're made of these sticks, they can easily get broken, and they have a life of no more than about 20 years. They will be killed by a hurricane roughly every 20 years. So they try to grow very, very fast, but that makes them more susceptible to bleaching. On the other hand, if you go to the next slide, which shows these massive boulder-type corals, these take in a form of zooxanthellae which makes them much less susceptible to bleaching, but they grow very, very slowly. That coral there on the top right-hand side is probably over 150 years old, and they have a long-term plan, whereas the corals in the top left, the plate coral and the staghorn coral, there's no point in growing slowly and surviving the bleaching event because you're going to be killed by a hurricane in the next 20 years anyway. So if we move on to the next slide, essentially the corals have this ability to adapt. And what they can do is they can change the zooxanthellae that are living within them. There are many species of zooxanthellae, and depending on which one they take in, they may grow very, very rapidly but be susceptible to bleaching, or they can grow very, very slowly and be unsusceptible to bleaching. But this is a problem. If you grow very slowly and you survive the bleaching, that might be bad because the other corals will outcompete you. So there's this sort of balance that they have to try to deal with. And there is no temperature threshold, no hard threshold. It varies. And the other thing is that after the coral bleaches and gets rid of the zooxanthellae, it can take in a different type of zooxanthellae that makes it more suitable for that particular climate. So it can do the most amazing thing, that by just changing the zooxanthellae, the coral can adapt to a warmer climate. And this is totally different to almost any other species. It makes coral reefs adaptable to climate change more than almost any other organism. Any other organism, like a tree, has to go through many generations of reproduction, which might take hundreds of years to adapt to a different climate. All that a coral needs to do is get rid of the zooxanthellae, bring in a different type of zooxanthellae, which is more adaptable to high temperature, and it's okay. It can deal with another 1 or 2 degrees hotter. All right, so if we go on to the next slide, which is a map of the Great Barrier Reef, there's actually a very good reason why corals need to be adaptable to temperature changes, and that's because when a coral spawns, its progeny may live in a totally different climate. So a coral that spawns in the middle of that picture may drift northwards in the North Queensland current and settle in warmer water, which is 1 or 2 degrees hotter, or it may drift south in the East Australia current where the water is 1 or 2 degrees colder. So unlike a tree which just drops its seed and lives in the same climate, corals will live in a different climate to their to the parent. All right, if we move on to the next slide, which is about ocean acidification, I do regard this as a potential threat because there are some experiments which seem to show that if you do change the ocean pH by higher carbon dioxide concentrations, the coral does, under some experiments, grow a bit slower. But don't panic yet. If we go on to the next slide, which shows the coral growth rates, it looks like we should be panicking. This actually is very equivalent to the hockey stick curve, except it's coral growth rates which go along from 1900 to about the year 2000, and you can see they collapse from about 1990 onwards. Now, it turns out that there were 2 major flaws in this very, very famous picture, which is still being used, and my group found the 2 flaws. If we move on to the next slide, the way this coral calcification or growth rate data is taken is that they take a big coral like this one in this next picture, and they drill a hole in that, and the coral has rings in it just like tree rings. So it's even like the hockey stick curve because it's almost like tree rings. If we move on to the, that's the bottom picture, you can see the rings on the coral. If we move to the next diagram, which has 2 graphs, we see on the left the original graph showing the collapse in the coral growth rate at 1990, whereas on the right-hand side, we have what we actually corrected the data, or corrected the analysis, I should say. What they'd actually done is from about 1900 to 1990, they'd used large corals to take these rings, but from 1990 up to 2003, they tended to use small corals, and it turned out that big corals tend to grow more slowly than the little corals, and when we accounted for that, this sudden drop in the calcification rate disappeared. And it turns out, if you look at that right-hand graph, that if anything, there may have been a slight increase in the coral growth rate, but if you take into account the error bars, you'd be brave to say that. But you certainly can't say that there is a reduction in coral growth rate. If we move on to the next slide, it talks about there's actually about an 11% increase in the coral growth rate on the offshore and what we call the mid-shelf reefs. But on the inner shelf reef, there's maybe a 5% reduction in growth rate since the 1940s. But it turns out that the 11% increase is where there's 99% of the coral. So where there's 99% of the coral, there's about a 10% increase in the coral growth rate, which is a good news story. All right, if we move on to the next slide, we've got to ask the question is, how can all this really bad science be coming out? And essentially we have a quality assurance problem in these environmental sciences, but it's not just the environmental science, it's actually right across a science that's not used in sort of major industry. So this is a quote from Richard Horton, who's the editor of one of the most prestigious journals, and he said, peer review, which is the main system of quality assurance, we know that the system of peer review is biased, unjust, unaccountable, incomplete, easily fixed, often insulting, usually ignorant, occasionally foolish, and frequently wrong. That is our main quality assurance mechanism that we use in the science. And it's now well recognised in the rest of science that we have a thing called the replication crisis. And I often ask the question, who would you trust most, a used car salesman or a scientist? And unfortunately, the answer is not the scientist. Sorry, we should have moved on to the next slide there where it says replication crisis. If we can now move on to another slide which says, which starts with Professor John Ioannidis. So John Ioannidis is what I would call the father of the replication crisis, and he published this most remarkable paper about the biomedical sciences, which was titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." Okay, and he's shown that about 85% of our resources are wasted because we're basing it on papers which are wrong. Now, this is not climate change, this is not Great Barrier Reef, this is general science. If we move on to the next slide, this is actually well known in the pharmaceutical industry, where drug companies check promising university research, where they may be wanting to take a chemical which the university is perhaps saying will cure cancer. The drug companies will, first thing they'll do is they'll try to replicate that experiment, and what they find is that about 80% of the time the original work is wrong. It's a staggering statistic. So if we move on to the next slide, which again has a picture of Richard Horton, editor of the Lancet magazine, this is what he says about science. The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue, afflicted by studies with small sample size, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, and flagrant conflicts of interest of dubious, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. And even in the ocean acidification research, we have people who want to, what they say, and this guy Howard Brauman, who's a very important scientist, said we need to apply organised scepticism to the ocean acidification research. So he's basically saying there's quite a lot of bad literature out there, and we need to look at correcting some of that. Okay, I could go on forever about some of the other untrustworthy research, but on the Great Barrier Reef, and I'll come back to the Great Barrier Reef now. Sorry, this is the next slide where it says other examples of untrustworthy science results. Have we got that, hopefully? You would have heard maybe in the news that 93% of the reef bleached in 2016. Well, actually, the number is probably about 8% actually died. Now, that sounds like a lot of coral. 8% of the Great Barrier Reef died, but it's not, because it has this incredible ability to recover. It turned out that the southern 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef, there was a 250% increase in the Great Barrier Reef between 2011 and 2016. So an 8% reduction is just nothing, okay? And it recovers from that very rapidly. You may have heard that crown of thorns starfish plagues are eating the Great Barrier Reef, and they certainly do, but they're entirely natural. We know from the geological evidence that they've been around for thousands of years and may have actually in the past been much worse than they are now. But there's some rather incredible claims. It is claimed that coal dust is damaging the Great Barrier Reef. So we have very large coal export terminals, and supposedly what happens is that coal dust blows off the conveyor belts up to 200 kilometres distance and is damaging the Great Barrier Reef. Well, it turned out the paper that was reporting this made a small error of about 3,000% in the concentrations, and then another eminent scientist exaggerated the area that the coal dust was supposedly reaching by another factor of 10, by about 1,000%. And he did that in front of an Australian government Senate inquiry. It was a staggering thing, and it was just trying to target coal with this extremely dodgy science. The farmers are also saying that pesticides are killing the Great Barrier Reef, but unbelievably, when you actually go out on the Great Barrier Reef, because of the massive flushing from the Pacific Ocean, pesticides are usually utterly undetectable on the Great Barrier Reef, where 99% of the corals live. And then I think the most remarkable one is pharmaceuticals are also supposedly a medium risk to the Great Barrier Reef. Now, this is when if you take a drug, a headache tablet, it passes through your body to a sewage, through the sewage treatment plant, and supposedly then goes another 100 kilometres out to the Great Barrier Reef and is a medium risk. But when you actually look at the data, you think, well, what were they actually measuring in the terms of the concentrations out on the reef? And you find they didn't actually measure it out on the reef. They didn't even measure it inshore. In fact, almost all the measurements were taken on the outlet pipe of the sewage treatment plant, and the concentrations were very, very low, and they did not take into account the incredible dilution that would take place between the sewage treatment plant and the Great Barrier. It's just unbelievable that this type of stuff can get into major public policy documents. All right, if we go to the last slide, we actually look at what the actual coral cover does. So the top left-hand graph is the coral cover for the southern Great Barrier Reef. Now, this data is fairly reliable from about 1990 onwards. Before that, it's not particularly reliable. Definitely reliable from, or pretty well definitely reliable from 1990 onwards. And you see from the southern Great Barrier Reef, from about 1990, it goes up and down, and then there's this big crash in the coral cover that happened in 2011. And this was a very major hurricane that actually tracked down the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef and totally wiped out almost all the coral. And then you can see the very, very spectacular recovery in less than a decade, and then a little bit of a drop-off, which is caused by a bit of bleaching there. If we go to the bottom right diagram, we can see the total coral cover for the whole Great Barrier Reef. And you see from 1990 onwards, it goes up and down, and again, it tracks downwards and crashes at around about 2010-11. Again, this is by two major cyclones in the total Great Barrier Reef, and then it recovered, and then it has come back down in 2017 after the bleaching. But essentially, there is about the same amount of coral on the Great Barrier Reef as there always has been since records began. The coral calcification rates over the last 100 years, in fact, over the last 300 years, if anything, are increasing. In fact, all the vital signs of the Great Barrier Reef look incredibly good. The one problem that we really do have on the Great Barrier Reef is the utter unreliability and untrustworthiness of the science institutions that are working there. And this is a problem which is in climate science, and in fact for every single environmental threat that we have around the world. You just cannot rely on these institutions. And so what I'm proposing in Australia, and we have a Senate inquiry looking at this exact thing, is what I'm calling an Office for Science Quality Assurance, where we can have a genuinely independent group of scientists who can look at this stuff and audit the work, and a proper audit, not the IPCC type of audit, which we would need to avoid. So that's what we're trying to do on the Great Barrier Reef. But the main moral of the story is the Great Barrier Reef is in absolutely fabulous condition, and you should come out and see it. Thanks very much.
Peter, I don't hear whether you can hear the roaring applause. I mean, I think it was quite a success. So we have a Q&A. Wir machen jetzt eine Frage und Antwort, und Sie stellen Ihre Frage in der Sprache Ihrer Wahl.
Mr. Ritt, one quick question. Has there been any witness or evidence from bleached corals that came back to life? Was there any reports on that?
Oh, yes. No. The bleached coral not almost always, but certainly more than half the time, well more than half the time, bleached coral will completely recover.
And there's like reports, photographs, this is like monitored scientifically. Yet.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's very well known that most of the time bleached coral will recover. It's a defense mechanism to try to make it survive. In fact, probably if the coral doesn't bleach quick enough, it's more likely to die. But if it bleaches quickly, it will probably recover.
Okay, because we in Germany only get those bleached out coral pictures, and then we think afterwards it's like a dead coal field. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And sometimes that happens. But of course, what then happens is that the untrustworthy scientists in the untrustworthy science institutions will focus on those pictures, and then a month afterward, when it's all dead and covered in slime, and that's what you will get in the German and the British and the American media. The ones that recover and bounce back to life, you don't hear about those, but that's actually the great majority of them.
My name is Gerd Schwecke. My question is, who is interested in all this fraud? Why is it so?
Well, in my view, it's because the scientists are out of control. There is no auditing of them. You can imagine if we had a financial system where there was no audits of companies or government departments, there would be fraud and embezzlement all over the place. So because they're never checked, this is what happened. Then you have the situation that I think in the Great Barrier Reef in particular, most of the scientists are ideologically driven. They've always wanted, since they were very young children, to be a marine biologist and go and work on the Great Barrier Reef. There are lots and lots of German scientists in Townsville working on the Great Barrier Reef, and they are emotional. I've seen them when they see dead coral, they actually have an emotional reaction to it. And if you have ideological scientists who are peer-reviewed by other ideological scientists, then what we've got is actually inevitable, which is total unreliability.
Could you please explain why you lost your job?
I lost my job after saying essentially what I've just said, which is that due to peer review being completely insufficient quality assurance, a couple of the Great Barrier Reef science institutions their work must be regarded as untrustworthy because so much of their work has been proven to be wrong, and their quality assurance systems are definitely inadequate, and that's what sparked it all off.
So I think, Peter, you answered all questions. Ich glaube, da sind jetzt keine Fragen mehr. And thank you very much, Peter, and also for saving so much CO2 emissions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. About a ton of emissions.
Okay, the crowd is happy, and hope to see you next time, sometime here at one of our events, Peter.
Okay.
All together.
All right.
Okay,
I'll
bye.
sign off now. Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.